Our modern minds look back at our most ancient stories and strain to find them relevant, principally because we no longer consider them true. Humanity once thought these to be true, we say, but now we see them as myths, stories our enlightened minds realize couldn't possibly be true. Noah and the Ark is one of these myths. We all know the story, but like so many other myths, we've largely relegated the story to the level of a children's tale, perfect for toddler books, puzzles, and nursery wallpaper, but not something we generally hold out as relevant to our lives in the 21st century. Today I'm going to ask you to look back at this story with fresh eyes, and at least hold open the possibility that we've been thinking about myths, and this story in particular, from a limiting perspective. Seen in a new light, the story of Noah and the Ark will become relevant to your life, and it will make clear how Ampelis can be of value to you and your family. Let's start with the definition of myth. Instead of meaning a story no longer considered true, traditionally, a myth was considered a story that was truer than true. A story containing patterns that are perennially true and perpetually relevant. If you look back at the story of Noah and the Ark as this kind of myth, then its relevance is unlocked. What patterns then does this story contain that makes it something worth paying attention to? At its most basic level, Noah and the Ark is a story about the end of a world by way of a flood and the beginning of a new world. Humanity has been talking about the end of the world for millennia, and so far, we're still here. But this isn't a story about that. It's about the end of a world. And a casual look at humanity's past and present reveals that individual worlds end and begin all the time. Civilizations, eras, periods, ages, conquerings, and ecological collapses can all be considered endings and beginnings of worlds at the societal level. And worlds end and begin at the personal level as well, such as during the transition from childhood to adulthood, when a spouse betrays another, or when a debilitating illness is discovered. When a world ends, it nearly always is because of an encompassing flood. Most of the world is washed away in such floods, but certain people, individuals, and their families, who can see clearly what's coming, prepare and build an ark before such floods arrive, and not only survive the flood, but are lifted up by it and begin the world anew in the tops of the mountains. The question becomes then, is there a flood on the horizon today? These are strange times. A moment's thought produces numerous areas of concern. The effects of the pandemic, global supply chain issues, rampant government spending, epidemics of mental health issues, opioid abuse and suicide, ecological concerns, chaos around sexuality and gender, massive departures from formal religions, conspiracy theory, massive loss of trust in societal institutions, slavery to screens and devices, lives utterly dependent on the supposedly free services of a few massive corporations, the possibility of the emergence of a new kind of artificial consciousness that could disrupt how we see humanity, and perhaps underlying everything, a general crisis of meaning. And yet for many of us, times have never been better, net worths never higher, opportunities for pleasure and amusement never more abundant. And if there's one thing we may be worried about for our children and grandchildren, it is a sickness of affluenza, a psychological malaise that often occurs when youth are given an abundant financial inheritance with all the flashy niceties that accompany it, without an inheritance of meaning and value. So in these strange times of worry and prosperity, should we be concerned of a coming flood, or will life simply proceed relatively undisrupted as it has for our lifetimes? The prudent will hope for the best and plan for the worst, and so we return to the story. Noah was not just anyone. The story says he was blameless in his generation and walked with God. You need not be religious to get a sense of what this means. This was someone who kept themselves allied with and had a relationship with what was most real and most important. And because of this, he could see clearly to build an ark for his family before the coming calamities arrived in full force. Ampelis exists in order to help people enter into the patterns of this story. We work with accomplished individuals and their spouses to help them to gather and make sense of the best values, principles, and vision of what has made you and your spouse who you are, to work these into a framework of meaning, and then to effectively transmit these things to your posterity as a gift, as an ark, a protection against future floods. If the nature of coming floods is punctuated by a loss of meaning, then an effective ark will consist in the very cultivation of meaning. Such an ark, we believe, and the story supports, is not merely protection from a flood, but it becomes the means for an entire family to be lifted higher than they ever have before by the very floods which destroyed those who failed to provide their families with an ark. We invite you to allow Ampelis to help you and your family enter into the patterns of your own grand story that will be worth telling on to the generations of your posterity.